I grew up hearing poems read on mornings while we breakfasted, and sometimes in the afternoon or in the evening before bed. You read me poems with love and longing for the world that met us there, that glistened like a rose held gently in the sacred hands of prayer. I made my own way in the world. I found a love of growing things. Today, I kneel with shears in hand. The field around me blooms and sings with all that's lovely and alive. Who knew this ground could yield a poem? Odysseus left Calypso's isle. My ship of words is bound for home. I wrote that poem after my mom's 80th birthday party, which I will mention again later. Lise Milau Davis was born on March 11, 1935 in Schaltau, Germany, a farming village of about 100 people. Her father's family had lived there for over 300 years. Her mother's family had purchased their property in the 1920s. When Mom wrote out her life story in detail a number of years ago, she called Schaltau her childhood paradise and said, "To this day, I can still name all its inhabitants, can see in my mind their houses, their courtyards, their gardens." Her father, Ewald Milau, and her mother, Lisa Reinecke, weren't married until 20 months later when Lisa gave birth to another child. Lieselotte called her grandmother Mama, and that grandmother was very much like a mother to her. The family expanded to 3 children, my mother, her brother Valna, and the youngest brother Martin. Mom and her brothers spent summers and vacations at the Reinecke farm, and Mom absolutely loved it there. She knew everyone in the village and would sometimes have dinner at someone else's house. Plus, she had a passel of older adult relatives who adored her and made much of her. Ewald Milau had wanted to be a farmer, but couldn't find a farm he could afford to buy. So the Reinecke and Milau families pooled their resources to allow him to put money down on a pub in the town of Brettine, 55 kilometers from Schaltau. Ewald also became the postmaster and justice of the peace of Brettine. The pub became quite successful, and he was able to pay off the entire loan before he was conscripted into the German army just 3 years later. Ewald loved children, and my mother had many fond memories of him singing and playing with her. His death at age 31 from a grenade explosion in Russia on Christmas Day was one of the great tragedies of my mom's life. She was only 6 when he died, and my grandmother was 25. My grandmother never remarried, and she told my mom nearly every day that she was ugly because she looked like him and his family. My mom always loved school. When her beloved elementary school teacher, Frau Junge, loaned her an anthology of German poetry, my mom said that her love of the lyric was born. Frau Junge encouraged the recitation of poetry in class, and my mom started memorizing and reciting poems. When the locksmith opened her father's desk, Mom had books of her own for the first time. One of them was Fritz Reuter's Ut meine Sturmtiet, a book about which she wrote her dissertation almost 40 years later. When Mom was 13, she went and argued her case to the director of the high school in the next town over that she should be allowed to skip 8th grade and go straight to high school. Her wish was granted. She made many close friends in high school. In the gymnasium, or high school, in Germany at the time, the class stayed together in one room all day while the teachers came and went, very different from our system. Her class started having annual class reunions in 1982, and these reunions grew and grew, especially after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Mom so loved the class reunions and stayed in touch with many classmates in between reunions. In order to make it financially possible for Mom to go to high school instead of entering into an apprenticeship where she would have been earning a little money, her mother took back the pub which she had been renting out, and with the help of my mother, started running it again. My mother, 14 when she started doing this, would wait tables in the afternoons, and since things were usually slow at that time, she could often also work on her homework. Mom also sang in the choir under the direction of Dietrich Krüger, and she said that in the class reunions, many people would say that doing music with him was a big highlight of their school years. The choir traveled for performances and sang on the radio. This was my mom's introduction to classical music, which was a lifelong love for her. Mom also had an extremely influential literature teacher in high school, Dr. Friedrich Rostock, who had returned from long years in Russian POW camps to teach Latin and German. Mom wrote in her unpublished autobiography, "Through him, my attention was directed to the uses of language as an artistic and aesthetic medium." And thus a lifelong passionate journey began, which only grew stronger with age. It was a gift that I could make use of even in those years of my life when I was no longer working with literature professionally. And I just want to add too that Dr. Rostock, because he had a doctorate, he would have been teaching at the university level if he weren't in communist East Germany. He wasn't a party member. In the spring of 1953, the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutsch, which was basically the Communist Party in East Germany, organized a youth wing called the Freie Deutsche Jugend. Many of Mom's classmates were members of a church-sponsored group called the Junge Gemeinde, young community or congregation, in order to avoid communist indoctrination. In March of 1953, all the students were ordered to assemble in the school's large assembly hall. The functionaries of the FDJ sat at a long table in front and took turns relating horror stories about the misdeeds of the Junge Gemeinde, none of which had actually happened. They presumably had beaten up Russian soldiers, mistreated orphans in church-run orphanages, and acted as spies for the Americans. The members of the Junge Gemeinde were asked to publicly denounce these misdeeds and leave the organization. They then said that any students who insisted on remaining members would be kicked out of school. Mom was sitting beside a friend of hers from the rowing club, who was a very active member of the Junge Gemeinde. The friend was shaking with anger and fear, and Mom was holding her hand in hopes of providing some comfort. Mom then raised her hand and pointed out that there are swine in every organization, and gave the example of the former director of the school who had been a zealous member of the SAD and had been caught forging corrections on the exams of his favorite students. When Mom graduated from high school a few months later, an FDJ official wrote on her diploma, "Zeigte wenig Interesse an der Arbeit der FDJ," shows little interest in the work of the FDJ. Mom wrote in her autobiography, "My goose was cooked." And I should not have been surprised by the rejection letter from the Humboldt Universität in Berlin, where I had applied for admission. When the rejection letter came in late August, Mom took it with her to the meadow behind the kitchen garden and cried. She wrote in her autobiography, "I had the feeling that the sky had changed color from blue to black." The next day, she and a boy from her school who had also been rejected took the train to Berlin and went to the admissions office of the Humboldt, where they had to wait in a long line before getting to speak to an official. The boy later said he thought Mom would be arrested on the spot because when she spoke with the official, she demanded to know how her rejection corresponded to the dictum of the government, everyone according to their talents and capabilities. Was the government lying and purposely leading its citizens astray? The official finally said that Germanistik was absolutely filled up, but they could offer her a Studienplatz or study spot in philosophy. She considered accepting for a few minutes, but when she reflected that the study of philosophy in the GDR invariably meant studying Leninism and Stalinism, of which she wrote in her autobiography that she had heard all she wanted to hear for her lifetime in high school. When she said no to the offer, the official encouraged her to reapply the following year. Mom got a job teaching Russian in the grammar school of a small village. She wrote in her autobiography, "Thus began 2 very miserable years of my life. Kids in East Germany at the time, especially in small villages, were definitely not excited about learning Russian, and it wasn't what Mom wanted to be teaching either." She reapplied to the Humboldt Universität the following summer, was rejected again, and taught Russian for another year. When she reapplied to the Humboldt and was rejected yet a 3rd time, she decided that she needed to leave East Germany. She applied to and was accepted at the Freie Universität in West Berlin, which had been established in 1948 as an independent institution where individuals would be able to teach, study, and conduct research free of fear and without a one-sided commitment to any political doctrine. I took that from the Wikipedia page of the Freie Universität. Classes were scheduled to start in September of 1955. At that time, East Germans were allowed to take the train through West Berlin, but they weren't supposed to get off there. Mom had planned to illegally get off in West Berlin and stay with a relative of a neighbor from the village until her scholarship money came through and she could secure an apartment. In August, at least 2 weeks before she was planning to leave, a policeman who knew her noticed her walking in the streets of Latin and asked why she wasn't at her teaching position yet since school had started. She went home and told her mother that instead of leaving in 2 weeks, she needed to leave the next morning. She packed 2 suitcases, one with clothes and one with her feather bed, and left the next morning, not knowing if she'd ever see any of her family again. Her scholarship money didn't come through for 2 weeks. She told us that she lived on bread and margarine for those 2 weeks and started to get lightheaded from malnutrition. Mom attended the FU for 2 years. The first year she was there, she met my American father at a Mardi Gras party where he was wearing pajamas and a necktie. My dad was working in Berlin as a translator for the American Army, where he was translating East German newspapers. At first he thought my mom might be a spy. My father was from a very traditional New England family. His father, my grandpa, was a lawyer, and his mother, whom we always called Grammy, was a homemaker. Grammy and Grandpa came to visit Mom and Dad before they were engaged, and Mom always said that she doesn't know if she would have consented to marry my dad if she hadn't had that chance to meet his parents, who were very warm and friendly to her. When my father was transferred to Frankfurt, my mother went there with him. They were married at the town hall in Frankfurt in 1957. Later that same year, they returned to America together, and shortly after that, my mother became pregnant with my brother Fred, who was born in July of 1958. Mom and Dad lived with Dad's parents for a short time, with the whole family being very welcoming, and then moved to an apartment in Brighton, Massachusetts. Mom always told us how much she loved being a mother and that she was very grateful to get to be a stay-at-home mom when we were all really young. She spoke German to my brother at first, but said as soon as he started socializing with other kids, he started replying in English. After that, our family language became English. My sister Sue was born in 1961 and I was born in 1964. By then, our family had moved to a suburban house in North Haven, Connecticut, where we lived for almost 8 years. Fred and Sue started school in the North Haven schools. In 1965, Mom started taking classes at Southern Connecticut State College, where she completed her bachelor's degree in 1971. My dad's business was doing quite well, and he and my mom decided to have a house custom built in the beautiful town of Old Lyme, Connecticut, where we moved in 1969. Unfortunately, my parents had not lived there for long when they started having marital problems. They separated in 1971 and were divorced in 1972. My mom had been returning to West Germany periodically to visit with friends and family there. My great-grandmother and great-aunt were permitted to travel to West Germany and even to the United States because the East German government didn't mind having retired people leave. They weren't contributing to the economy anyway. But Mom hadn't seen her mother or other relatives in the 18 years since she had escaped. In 1972, the United States began negotiations to establish formal relations with East Germany. Because my mother had left East Germany illegally, if she had tried to return prior to 1972, she would have been imprisoned. But starting, I believe, at the end of 1972, people who left illegally were allowed to return as long as they exchanged a certain amount of West German marks for East German marks at a 1-to-1 ratio for every day that they were in East Germany. At the time, a West German mark was worth about 4 East German marks, so you were basically paying to be there. We also had to register with the police station and let them know exactly where we were going to be every day. We traveled to East Germany for 10 days in 1973, and it was an unforgettable experience. Truly another world, so different from our Connecticut suburb. My mom felt she needed to get a job in order to make ends meet so we could stay in our old Lyme house. She toyed with the idea of becoming a real estate agent, but ultimately decided to complete a teacher preparation course at Connecticut College. She then taught German as an adult education class in Old Lyme and applied to teach German at Old Lyme High School, but was rejected in favor of another teacher who was able to teach both French and German, and who was a terrible teacher. My sister and I both had her, and she was awful. Mom got a job a few hours a week reading various works of German literature to Hermann Weigand, a retired professor who had taught German literature at Yale for 32 years. Professor Weigand was a specialist in Thomas Mann. The 12 years that my mom read to him were like an exciting private seminar with one of the foremost German literature experts in the US. I'm quoting from Mom's Wikipedia page here. Through her connection with Professor Weigand, Mom then got a part-time job as a research assistant to Professor George Schoolfield, a professor of German and Scandinavian literature. She ultimately got a full-time job as the administrative assistant in the comparative literature department at Yale, a job she dearly loved and held for 9 years. Thus began a new and very exciting chapter in my mom's life, her long association with Yale. At the comparative literature department, she fielded all phone calls, typed papers and correspondence for the professors in the department, and had long conversations with the graduate students about their dissertations. She loved all aspects of her job, and over the dinner table at home always had stories to tell about all the fascinating characters she was meeting and the interesting things she was learning. Mom attended seminars by well-known scholars, including Jacques Derrida, an extremely influential scholar and philosopher, whom we got to hear about at the breakfast table. After 9 years of working as the administrative assistant in comparative literature, Mom left to work as the administrative assistant in the German department. In 1981, she enrolled as a graduate student while still working at the German department full-time. She took 16 seminar classes with well-known Germanists, including Ingeborg Glia, Peter Demetz, George Schoolfield, and Jeffrey Sammons. Mom completed her oral exams with distinction in 1984. I remember sitting in the hallway where her exam was taking place with Ralph Hexter, who is now a distinguished professor of classics and comparative literature and also served as the president of Hampshire College for many years. Ralph had a bottle of champagne and popped the cork when Mom emerged from her exam. She completed her doctoral dissertation in 1986. It was later published as a book. The title is History and Narrative Structure, Ut meine Stromtid by Flitzreuter and Jahrestage by Uwe Jonsson. Receiving her doctoral degree from Yale was one of the proudest moments of her life, and Sue and I got to attend her graduation ceremony and excitedly cheer her on. Mom taught German language and literature classes at Yale for 14 years as a senior lector until her retirement in 2000. One of her favorite teaching memories was teaching intensive German with her good friend Howard Stern, where students learned what would normally be 2 years of German in 1. She traveled to Germany in the summers, often giving lectures for the Flitzreuter Society. She also taught in the summer at the University of Rostock in Germany. Additionally, she got to be friends with the Grand Duke of Mecklenburg and co-wrote his memoirs. After she retired, my mother was able to rent a small apartment in Berlin where she lived for 5 months a year and began a decade-long pattern of living in Berlin for 5 months, Hamden for 6 months, and helping with the blueberry harvest at my farm in Oregon for 1 month. I loved getting to work with Mom, and she loved harvesting blueberries and selling blueberries and various kinds of jam at my farmer's market booth with me. Mom went swimming every day in the Lucky Mute River next to our property. One time when we were swimming there together, I remember remarking how much she clearly loved being in the water, and I remember her saying, "I'm a fish, you know," while swimming. She was a Pisces. Mom enjoyed taking Tai Chi classes at the Hamden Senior Center for many years after her retirement, and also took some literature classes at the Institute for Learning in Retirement. I remember particularly that she took one on Chaucer. Mom was also in a monthly book group for many years through the Yale University Women's Organization, and also a German book group. I think that Mom's very favorite activity in retirement, besides her time in Germany, was a wonderful Wallingford poetry group called Saturday Mornings with Poetry. The group would be given a prompt to write a poem for the next session, and then everyone would bring typed copies of their new poem and read it out loud. Mom loved that group and everyone in it. It was so wonderful for her to have a group in which everyone shared her love of poetry. For her 80th birthday, she had a party at a restaurant called The Library that used to be the Wallingford Library. Many people from the poetry group were there, and she asked anyone who wanted to bring a poem, and everyone who brought a poem got to read their poem out loud. It was such a special party. That was the party that inspired me to write the poem that I recited at the beginning of this talk. Mom moved to Atria Larson Place in Hamden in 2022 and then to the Towers in New Haven in 2023. She was an enthusiastic participant in many activities at the Towers, including the weekly Create a Word group, the choir, and the exercise group, and continued to go for daily walks until just a couple of weeks before she died. Mom was diagnosed with ALS in July of 2025, which explained a number of symptoms that she'd been having for about 2.5 years. She passed away on September 11th, 2025. And then I've got something also that my sister wrote, more about how Mom affected her as a person. Let me just pull that up here. Let's see. So this is my sister talking. I learned a lot from my mother, as we all did. She imparted lots of things to me, both explicitly, like to call adults Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, because that is customary in the Germany she grew up in. There are still some people who were adults that I can only call by their last names because it just doesn't seem right otherwise. And the implicit learning lessons, like enjoying the world and feeling that the world is open to me. I can go out and explore like she did. I'd like to share a couple of memories of my mother and the things that I learned from her, sometimes what she wanted me to learn and just sometimes what I took from it. The first memory that occurred to me was from one of the family trips that we took to Germany. This was with my mother, my sister, and I when I was 17. We crossed the border into East Germany in the south at Helmstedt, I believe. We were supposed to travel directly to where we were going, which was to her brother's house in Genthin in the north. There was no veering off the highway. We were supposed to only stay on the highway and go there directly. Well, my mother had other ideas. We were passing near Weimar, and she wanted to stop and see the Goethe house there. It was her country too, she said, and they had no right to limit her like that. So we stopped in Weimar and toured the Goethe house. I can't remember if we tried to limit the amount of English we spoke so we wouldn't draw attention to ourselves. That was one instance where I learned the world was open to me to go out and explore, despite governments and laws at times, which might have been a dicey lesson, but I've taken in more the heart of it than the law-defined part. I've loved cats since I was young. I had a white stuffed cat when I was little, and I wanted a real cat. We couldn't have pets because my brother and sister were both allergic to them, but they grew out of that as they got older, and we started petitioning to have the cat. No, my mother said. To her, having grown up partly on a farm, cats were working animals. They kept the barn free of rodents. They did not live in the house. Well, Eleanor came into our lives. My mother and sister found her in a storm drain one day, went out for a walk, and she followed them home. Well, my mother said, she could stay in the garage, but she can't come in the house. But then it got too cold, and we were worried that Eleanor would freeze. Okay, my mother said, she can come into the house, but she needs to stay in the basement. We even kept the basement door closed with our huge dictionary. Remember when houses would have huge dictionaries? But Eleanor learned to push that open and come into the upstairs. Okay, my mother said, she can be in the upstairs, but no sleeping on your beds. That got overruled eventually too, and Eleanor was part of our family. And Mom fell in love with Eleanor as much as the rest of the family did. I learned it's okay to evolve. It might even bring you a great love. My mother was a pretty good cook, especially when she was dating. After my parents' divorce, she liked to try new dishes to impress whoever she was dating at the time. Often the dishes turned out really well, but there was one, shrimp and grapefruit curry, that she saw in a magazine and decided to try. I think most of it remained uneaten. As you can imagine, not the best combination. But I learned it's fun to try things, even when some of them don't come out so well. I would often call my mother for advice, especially as a young adult. I remember going to buy a car for the first time. I was on my own, living in Boston, a young woman who knew little about cars and not much more about how to buy one. I had decided on a car and even negotiated a price that felt reasonable, but then they were throwing a bunch of other stuff at me. Insurance for something or other, floor mats, telling me how I needed all these things. I took a breath and asked to use the phone. This was long before cell phones, so I had to ask to borrow one of their office phones. I called my mom. Mom, they're saying I need floor mats and this insurance and some other stuff. Do I need those things? No, my mother said, they're just trying to sell you stuff. They always do that to make more money on the sale. You don't need any of that. I hung up the phone and went back in there, fortified that I was making the right decision by saying no. I learned good money management from my mother, which has helped all through my adult life. As you know, my mother loved literature. She loved it so much that when she started working at Yale, she would talk about it, often, sometimes over the breakfast table, sometimes in long, extended paragraphs and pages. even to a sleepy adolescent who literally laid her head on the table while her mother was talking. Even though my mother and I loved different things, and even though she didn't always understand how I could love the things I loved, I learned to love things, the arts especially, passionately, like she did. A last memory. When we lived in Old Lyme, we had a wonderful view of the sunset from the living room window. Many times I would find my mother there at sunset, quietly drinking in the day's beauty. We would stand together and watch while the sun sank below the horizon. Thank you, Mom, for teaching me to take in the beauty of the day in quiet and regular ways. Thank you for showing me how beautiful the world can be, and thank you for being on the journey with me.
Okay.